Thanks, Naomi. Everyone, great to be here. Great to see all of you. I'm Stephen Gardner. I've been doing this kind of work for about 30 years, and we are in a moment that calls to us and wants us to step up and take action. So first, before we take action, we want to understand what we're up against. And I'm going to share some slides here. And hopefully you can all see those. Well, administrative state, this in a way, compared to what some of my colleagues have talked about, sounds perhaps a little dull. I would like to point out that by administrative state, what is sometimes being called the quote unquote deep state, is all of the agencies of government that don't have to do with locking people up, surveilling them, basically repressing them in one way or another, the security state. So the rest of the government that deals with the public good, education, health, welfare, all of the things that we think of as ordinary services to the public. This is a direct quote from the Project 2025 Mandate for Leadership. The specific deficiencies of the federal bureaucracy, size, levels of organization, inefficiency, expense, and lack of responsiveness to political leadership are rooted in the progressive ideology that unelected experts can and should be trusted to promote the general welfare in just about every area of social life. This is sort of a general point of contention for the Heritage Project, which ironically claims expert status in what it does, that experts ought not to be trusted with the minutia of figuring out how to, say, regulate the environment. You can look at the photo at the top of the page, and it tells us that the EPA is reaching out to farm workers and saying that hey, maybe you should be protecting yourself if you're spreading high-risk herbicide like Dacthal. So this is the kind of regulation that Project 2025 imagines either turning over to the states, eliminating from the federal bureaucracy, or privatizing. So leaving it up to, say, chemical companies to decide what is safe and what is not. So to go into sort of a little bit deeper on that, the system there, the progressive system has broken down in our time, and the only real solution is for the national government to do less, to decentralize and privatize as much as possible, and then ensure that the remaining bureaucracy is managed effectively, blah, blah, blah. Well, what does this mean, the progressive system? It means the bulk of all of that executive branch function that, like I said, it doesn't involve in spying on people, shooting people, bombing people, or putting them in prison. So all of the ordinary functions of government oriented to regulating business, finance, and public services that are common not just in quote unquote industrialized democracies, but in prosperous countries everywhere, should be devolved to the states, handed over to local authorities, or privatized. Now, this was exactly the opposite of what my colleague Habiba was talking about, where the security state, like around policing, for example, should be imposed from the federal government. But when it comes to things like education and healthcare and issues of environmental regulation and financial regulation, well, that should be turned over to the states where it can be managed closer to the ground, quote unquote. But it's in reality, it's leaving local jurisdictions that are going to be relatively impotent in the face of things like multinational corporations that might want to exploit the resources that happen to exist in those communities, or exploit the labor that exists in those communities, to deal with those on their own. And this is the reality. It also opens the possibility of the extremes in political demagoguery that can break free at the local level and not have a counterweight if the United States government is not reaching out to promote a common good. Decentralize and privatize as much as possible. Those are the key words. Seems benign and kind of in alignment with the core program of traditional conservatism. But there are areas in which truly authoritarian politics align with certain aspects of traditional conservatism where they can find common ground. Not surprisingly, these are big political movements. Project 2025, though, is pointing us in a direction where everything that people rely on from the government, the things that they truly want by outstanding majorities, I mean, things like Medicare, to give an example, or support for useful healthcare, or having an interest in clean water and clean air, these kinds of things. If you destroy the regulatory apparatus, basically you're destroying the whole basis for people's trust, fragile as it already is, in having a shared form of governance, much less a democratic one. So one of the ways in which this could likely be implemented, and that Project 20, whether it's likely implemented or not, but this is what Project 2025 specifically suggests, proposes, that what was called Schedule F in the Federal Civil Service, which was thought up back at the Heritage Foundation back in before 2020 and introduced by a young former Heritage staffer to the first Trump administration, that basically makes it easier for any presidential administration, regardless of which, regardless of who is president, for the president to fire people or demote them if they don't find them to be politically amenable, or even when, ironically, part of their job might be to apply their expert knowledge to tell political officials that their judgment, their policy is wrong, that it's destructive. And this is what is called the Schedule F. It's a new part of the federal code that it was designed to make it easier to fire people, basically. So this is one mechanism among many. And this is how Project 2025 talks about it. They said that the Trump administration issued that order to make career professionals in positions that are not normally subject to change as a result of presidential transition. So they're talking about here, change from one president to another. Not only are we going to change the typical political appointees that are either the White House staff or that need approval from the Senate, we're going to reclassify members of the civil service if they have sort of a decision-making power, confidential policy determining and policy advocating positions, to make them suddenly the equivalent of a department head or a secretary or the head of an agency. And they explicitly say that rule, Schedule F, it should be reinstated. So decimate the civil service, get rid of the experts, and let the people who are basically political lackeys make not just set the political position, but decide on, for example, how much chemical pollution is too much for us to drink. So this is, again, environmental consequences, turn enforcement over to the states. A conservative U.S. Environmental Protection Agency will take a more supportive role towards local and state efforts, building them up so they may lead in a meaningful fashion. Again, turn it over to the states, who may be ill-equipped to stand up to the big arms manufacturers and mining companies and what have you. Then we have the financial consequences. I mean, there could be potentially hundreds of things that I could highlight in the administrative state. But one of the things, this bipartisan bill, the Dodd-Frank's Act, came out of the problems of the 2007-2008 Great Recession, and was created to try to prevent something like that from happening again. Project 2025 wants to eliminate key provisions of it, which focus extra attention on the largest financial institutions on the grounds that this isn't fair. Well, I mean, you can argue that it isn't fair in a society that supposedly frowns on monopolies for financial institutions to be so large that if they fail, it impacts the economy of the entire country. In education, again, this is just another example. There could be dozens more. From Project 2025, elementary and secondary education policy should follow the path outlined by Milton Friedman in 1955. That signal year for justice and fairness, 1955, before the Civil Rights Act, before the Civil Rights Movement, before the United States was reopened to immigration from parts of the world other than a trickle from Western Europe, and before second wave feminism, and before LGBTQ liberation movements, before key elements of the modern civil rights regime came into being, and by a man, Milton Friedman, who was sort of the godfather of ultra-conservatism, or in the financial mode, or a form of libertarianism. Let the education publicly funded, but education decisions are made by families. All right, so what does this mean? Well, it goes on to say, with approval, that states are eager to, this is a quote, to lead in K through 12 education. For decades, they have acted independently of the federal government to pioneer a variety of constructive reforms and school choice programs, choice being the key word. For example, in 2011, Arizona first piloted ESAs, which provide families roughly 90% of what the state would have spent on a child in public school to be used instead on education options such as private school tuition, online courses, and tutoring. This is a fascinating way to basically say education should be publicly funded, but people should be allowed to take that government subsidy and pump it into a private school of their choice. This is a formula literally to destroy private education, which for people like Friedman was always the goal anyway. And in the meantime, we know that where there are no federal standards, what is happening is the decimation of a curriculum that is dedicated to telling the truth about race, about gender, about religious freedom. This is a plan for letting, on a state by state and locality by locality, schools have basically nothing in common and no commitment to a shared vision, critical thinking vision of what democracy could be. And then we have, the court system, which is supposed to be the sort of last resort for people to challenge decisions by the government, the federal government in particular, or state governments, when things have gone awry. Well, in the last Supreme Court session, we know that the so-called Chevron decision was reversed, making it much, much easier for courts to intervene, not to regulate or challenge the actions of, say, big polluters or gun manufacturers, but to challenge the regulatory actions of the federal government and its agencies. This sounds like it could be a good thing. You could use it, for example, to challenge a corrupt immigration court that was cracking down on people crossing the border in a way that was unconstitutional. In reality, it's going to be inevitably the people with the deepest pockets who are going to be able to pay to litigate these kinds of decisions in the courts and prevent themselves, the financial institutions, the mining companies, the petroleum companies, the pharmaceutical companies, that are going to be able to litigate these cases and take it to a court that could take years to be resolved. And in the end, with the current composition of the federal courts, have a high likelihood of avoiding regulation. This is going to have a demoralizing effect on people whose task it is to try to make good expert decisions about regulations that are good for the American people, that are in favor of the public good, as opposed to the narrow private pocketbooks and corporate profit rates of the largest companies in the country. Thank you on that. I'm just going to bring this to a sort of conclusion here and say that Project 2025 is actually calling us to step up and educate ourselves and help others to become educated about what the consequences could be for the implementation of some of these, all of these types of limits on not just the administrative state, but on all of the areas in which Project 2025 is drawing a blueprint for what the Heritage Foundation and their allies thinks should be the future of this country. We have to build at the same time alternative visions, and we have to support each other in opposing authoritarianism in all its forms. So I will take this just back to the larger series that started last week and will continue next week, and say, for example, the harsh realities of the anti-immigrant movements, exclusionary vision, and drive for authoritarian enforcement. This is the example of a need for our movements to engage in approaches that both block continuing attacks on immigrant communities and also build policies and movement architecture that supports those communities. We have to support people with what they need, and we have to look out for laws and policies that hurt people. 15 years ago, the immigrant rights movement united in its opposition to Arizona's SB 1070, which was very draconian. It took years, but portions of the law were ultimately ruled unconstitutional. And the national face of that law, Sheriff Joe Arpaio, was voted out of office. Simultaneously, the movement applied relentless pressure on the White House, leading to the creation of DACA. This was, of course, over more than one administration. There were hard-fought victories and that still need to be defended. Today, we're seeing states across the country adopt SB 1070 style laws. A federal government operating on Project 2025's policy recommendations will embolden state lawmakers to pursue more invasive and exclusionary policies, just as the anti-immigrant movement would feel empowered to pursue its broader attacks on immigrants' constitutional protections and rights. And what goes for the anti-immigrant movement goes across the board for far-right actors who are interested in putting authoritarian and exclusionary pressure on racial, ethnic, religious minority communities, and to oppose any kind of robust public good of the sort that most people say they want. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you so much, Stephen. We're going to bring all of our researchers, Chloe, Habiba, and Stephen, to the mic. And as we're doing that, I want to invite you who are in the room attending this webinar to introduce yourself in the chat. Tell us who you are and where you're Zooming from. Maybe you want to share your organizational affiliation. And then if you're inspired to, go ahead and drop a question for this research team in the chat. I'm going to kick us off this Q&A period with a couple of questions for our researchers. But while we're doing that, please go ahead and tell us who you are and pose a question for these researchers. I want to start where Stephen kind of left off, talking about what we can do, how we can respond to the threat that is Project 2025. And so I want to ask you all to talk a little bit about how you think your research can shape movement strategy. We know that PRA is in an ecosystem with movement organizations who are on the ground, building bases of support, building power uh, as they can, when they can. How can this insight, this analysis about Project 2025 inform their strategy? And anybody can sort of start off. I see, Stephen, you're unmuted, so I don't know if you're ready to go, but
No.
uh,
But I'm happy to say just a couple of things. First of all, it's always been PRA's position that if you're going to oppose something that you intuit could be dangerous, it is your responsibility first to understand it, both in what it is, who is behind it, and to think through the potential consequences, and but both intended and unintended, primary and secondary. So that's the first point that I would make, and I will let my colleague. I have other things I can say, but I'll let my colleagues jump in.